Hi, everyone. Welcome to the, I think, 11th version of Let's Talk. We have Carly Downs back with us today and Carolyn McVicker assisting. And we're going to be talking about building better relationships at work and home. I'm Dr. Josh Eyer. I'm an assistant professor in the Capstone College of Nursing, and I do a bunch of research and teach stats and methodologies and other things. And Carly Downs is an assistant professor and clinical director in human development and family studies at the University of Alabama. She's the director of the Marriage and Family Therapy Clinic and a licensed marriage and family therapist in Alabama who specializes in working with anxiety, depression, and addictions. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about UA's Coronavirus Plan. Then we're going to talk about healthy communication, and then we're going to take questions and answers. So as many of you know, this semester is bearing down on us. We are starting again very soon, and UA has published a plan for the return to full operations. I had to read it. And it's their approach to starting the semester back up, starting up everything that we're going to have going on with a full semester with students and everything in the middle of a pandemic. So it's a plan for how we can keep each other safe, how we can stay safe. It's pretty comprehensive. Down here on the left, you'll see a link and then the cover to the actual document. And then this is the letter from the president that was sent out about the plan, which I'm not going to read to y'all. But I want y'all to be aware that that's there. And I'm going to give just an overview of what we'll be doing as we head back. Many of us have been doing one of the most time-sensitive things this week. So when we return to work, one second. Sorry, I had to cough. So the first and most important thing is hand washing, sanitation, disinfecting. The staff at UA are going to be disinfecting all of the facilities even more than normal. And we are supposed to be disinfecting ourselves more than normal by hand washing and doing other things. Face coverings are going to be a mandatory part of our participation on campus. And these will be whatever's comfortable. The university has left this pretty open. Any kind of cloth face covering made of common materials such as cotton that cover the mouth and nose and can be reworn after proper cleaning are appropriate to wear on campus. So very, very open. I've been wearing a bandana all summer because I get to be a bandit everywhere I go. Not to funerals, which I realized unfortunately last week that is like the only place all summer that I realized I can't wear a bandana. I will also not be wearing them to class. So I'm getting some other cloth, not all the time anyway. So whatever you feel comfortable with. And I think this is what I've been saying all along. The masks are really important to the public health strategy of dealing with the pandemic. And one of the key things that we can do to make that easier is find a mask that we like, that we're comfortable with. I've seen people have all sorts of fun things on the outside of their masks. And we have really good evidence for why we're doing that. Two studies that have recently been published are one where two COVID positive hairdressers saw over 100 clients and not a single person got infected from it. So that is like really meaningful evidence for why the masks can be useful. And then another one is research that comes from a meta-analysis that was published at UC Davis that shows that wearing a mask actually protects you when you wear the mask. And you are, I'm forgetting the exact number, but 60% less likely to get infected or something like that when you wear the mask. So that's some of the first evidence that we have that it actually does help us. And one of the reasons that you get different messages, because we've gotten lots of different messages about that, is think how many times people have told you what works about wearing a mask and what doesn't. We're actually all getting better at wearing masks. And so it makes sense that as we wear masks better, that they actually work better for us. Another thing is distancing at work. So there's a whole lot of policies that UA is rolling out about this. Many of those are you're going to hear about through your supervisor at work or your dean or whoever. Some employees will continue to work remotely after the end of limited business operations. For employees working on campus, staggered schedules and social distancing may be implemented. So some of us won't have to come into the office regularly. Some of us will have to only come in intermittently. And there will be schedules for us about when we can or cannot come in. And when we're there, it will also be important to remember to stay back, to keep 6 feet whenever you can, to not stay in the same small room with someone else if that's possible to avoid it. So the things that we do when we go out in public anyway, it'll be important to keep doing those when we go to work. It's not going to be returning to work as normal the way it has been when we've gone in the past. And then UA has rolled out a specific 3-point strategy. I'm finding that I have more trouble talking like 6-8 months into this pandemic than I did before. I think I'm talking a lot less than I used to. And the strategy is test, train, and check. So I'm going to be talking about the test and check now. The training is the online training that we are all supposed to complete. So testing. This week, almost all of us had to go into Coleman Coliseum and get our brain massaged through our nose. You now know how lobotomies were done, by the way. There was just a hammer involved. That's the basic difference between that testing and a lobotomy, and perhaps a fair amount of expertise. So reentry testing, there was a complete census done of most faculty and staff before COVID. I was negative, which I was happy to hear. I'm not currently asymptomatically positive. And the idea is that with a really good comprehensive baseline now, when we get to where we're all going back into buildings, they can test only a small portion of us and the people going into faculty staff clinic to get a sense of is COVID infection increasing in the population? Is it increasing dramatically in the population? Is it staying about the same? Who's getting it? By starting now with who they find are positive and then using data as we move along, they'll be able to find out a lot about how COVID is occurring in the employees at UA. And that's what sentinel testing is. So we started with the census testing, which is happening now, and sentinel testing is what's going to happen in the future. And this definition is from UAB, and UAB and UA are following the same basic plan. Random testing of a percentage of our population on a weekly basis will provide a snapshot of how much of the COVID-19 virus is circulating among our population. This testing will help us identify areas of concern and hotspots on campus to prevent a severe outbreak, particularly among our campus members who might be at higher risk for severe illness from COVID-19. And so the number that UAB said is 2.5% to 5%. Sentinel testing allows them to test as little as 2.5% to 5% of the population to see how things are changing. And of course, when people come in to faculty staff clinic with symptoms, or if they report symptoms in the next assessment tool that I'll talk about, then they go in and get tested. In that way, we'll be able to quickly identify how it might be spreading. If that gets out of hand, then the university will have to respond to that in a very different way than the way we're going into the semester right now. So that third part, the assessment tool, we've been hearing about it, but UA has actually rolled it out. And I don't know if y'all know this, but I took it and I've got some screenshots to share with y'all from taking it. They're going to want us to take this every day if we can, but it's mandatory to take it every 3 days. And it's a symptom reporting quick check. And that URL down there is where you can get to it. So the UA Health Check Assessment. You'll see here that on the first page, it talks about why they want our phone number. I do recommend that you put your phone number in there so that you get reminders to do this, because it'll be worse if the reminders are coming from your dean. And we will be hearing about it if we don't take it. And then this is what the assessment looks like. It wants your temperature, so all of us need to have access to a thermometer, and then any of these symptoms that have changed from normal in the last 14 days. So I didn't have any, and my temperature was below 100. And then this is what it told me, the last page. Have you been in close contact with anyone diagnosed or under investigation with COVID-19 in the past 14 days? And I thought it was interesting. You can't say no. You can either say, yes, I have, or I don't know. And that makes sense. So after I hit submit, it told me that I was at the least risk. They thanked me for participating, which I'm sure I'll see a lot of that message. And I was given this passport, and I'm not sure how the passports are going to be used yet because the full plan isn't finalized, but I assume that's so that I can go into work. And if I don't have this, I suspect that it will be a lot harder for me to get into my office. If y'all have any questions as we go, feel free to enter them in the chat or to use the question button, the Q&A button, and we'll try to answer them. We'll definitely have time at the end, but for any of this stuff that I've talked about, like now is a good time to ask. That's it, I'm almost done with this section. So these are the tools that we can look forward to. I just talked to you about health check. That's this part. I just showed you the passport that you can get. What's going to be coming in the future is an app that gives us our notifications. So if someone that we've been around has tested positive, it'll let us know. And it looks like it's going to give us a count of the number of people we've been around who are positive. Along with that, you'll see the health check here. We'll be able to take the assessment through the app on our phones. Currently, it's web-based. And we'll be able to report if we've gotten a positive test. I assume from what I've been told that there's actually going to be staff members at the university who will be following up with us, making sure that we're quarantining if we've been exposed and that we don't expose other people on campus to it. So pretty comprehensive plan. This same plan has been used, and this is virtually identical to the plan that I read about in places like Massachusetts General, which is Harvard's hospital, with almost no transmission of cases within the institution. All of the transmission was coming from outside the institution. So it might seem like the university is reckless to have us come back to campus, but it's actually employing a plan that's been shown to be effective at preventing transmission. Of course, the wild cards are going to be the students. As everyone knows, students are so easy to control that we know that this is going to go super well from start to finish. But the university is doing their best to have us come back to work in a very safe way. And that way has been shown safe, and hopefully we get good participation from the students and we have a nice, safe rollout of the semester. But the university will be monitoring that and letting us know. And I should tell you, I'm not paid to tell you that. This is my professional opinion. I think they're actually doing a good job with this. Okay, so here are some URL links that you'll be able to get later, or you can write down now. healthinfo.ua.edu is your ground central for all of that information. And that takes us to the presentation from Carly about building better relationships, and she's going to talk to us in particular about healthy communication. I'm so excited about this, Carly. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. So when Josh approached me to talk about building better relationships, it's interesting in our clinic when we have people coming in to receive mental health treatment, and it's about building a better relationship, whether that's a mother-daughter or whether that's a couple relationship. The number one complaint that they have is like communication, right? That's what everybody says, and it's always more complicated than that, but that's where a lot of the difficulty comes in. And we tend to be good communicators, but there are certain things that have been identified over years of research that can help us to just be conscious of to be better communicators. So a lot of this research comes from John Gottman's work, and he worked specifically on romantic relationships, but all that I'm going to talk about today applies to not only your relationship with your partners, but with your friends and your coworkers and everything else. So I'm going to talk today about a few concepts from this research that I think are really applicable. So startups, we're going to talk a little bit about meta communication, some real ways to be dysfunctional in your communication, utilizing what John Gottman calls the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, very dark sounding. We're going to talk about repair attempts and then the conflict blueprint. So we're going to go over these in much more detail. So to begin, one of the things that we need to remember when we're communicating really with anybody is the way we start up our communication. And I don't think we always think about the detail of that. When we are upset about something or we have a problem we need to get fixed, a lot of times we jump into that communication without really thinking about how we're jumping into that communication. A lot of times this is where we let our emotion kind of take over, and our emotion dictates what we're saying at this point. And it can really affect the way that a conversation between you and whoever really goes. And so, as an example, it's, saying something like, well, where have you been? Where are you? You're supposed to be here. As opposed to saying, hey, I was worried, or hey, I started to get anxious. Where have you been? Right? I mean, just the word usage and the tone we use, if we're conscious of that when we start communicating with people, it really does make a big difference. In some of John Gottman's work, he found that, only about 4% of the conflict discussions that he looked at, and he's looked at hundreds and thousands of partners, only about 4% of those ever reverse direction. So it's a very small percentage where if you start something that's anxiety filled or you start something that's anger filled, it takes a heck of a lot for that kind of tone, that vibe of the conversation to reverse its direction into something more positive. So I think as we're problem solving in our families right now, as we're returning to work in a difficult situation in this pandemic, paying attention to, okay, what is it that I want to say? What is it that, what's my motivation for this conversation? And how do I want to approach this? I think just being a little bit conscious of how you're starting a conversation can be really, really helpful. All right.
That is so true.
I know, and it's such a simple thing, right? It's so simple, and we just don't think about it.
It's hard to make yourself stop and think about how to enter, but this is like just one of those things that in my own life I can tell you is so true. I have so many times found myself 2 minutes into a fight where I was like, why didn't I just say that to get started? It never had to go this way.
Yes, I've been very conscious of this even with my kids recently, right? Like when I'm stressed and like my husband and I are juggling everything, when I walk into a room and I'm like, what are y'all doing? Right? Like, well, I just set the tone terribly, right?
Yeah.
Such a simple fix.
Yeah. And so many times I've said, I'm so sorry. I didn't say what I meant to say when this started. I wasn't thinking about it, and just try to like restart.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about that strategy because that's a repair.
Yes. Okay, great.
Talk about that. So I'm not going to, go over this idea of meta communication a ton because I think a lot of us are aware of what meta communication is, right? Communicating about communicating. It's kind of that secondary communication, our tone, our body language, things like that. But what's really important about meta communication is that if we don't utilize it and pay attention to how we're saying things and what we're giving off, that secondary communication, what happens is we leave a lot of room for assumption. And when we leave room for assumption in a conversation, it typically doesn't go great. Especially if you're having a conversation about a difficult topic or you're having a conflictual conversation or you're debating with somebody about something. Whenever you leave room for the other person to make an assumption about what you're saying and you're not being super clear, that is where we see the biggest issues happen. So, this is things like paying attention to the way you're saying things, paying attention to what your body language looks like, but then it's also commenting about the communication. If you're having a conversation that you feel like is escalating, to stop for a second and go, hey, you know what? I'm feeling like we're escalating. Hey, you know what? Like I'm starting to get frustrated and I don't want to talk in this frustration. That's you commenting on the way you're communicating in that moment. And by just taking a step back, and we notice this, I think naturally we notice when this is happening, like internally, but I think by just overtly stating that sometimes can be really helpful in changing the direction, whether you're in a faculty meeting and you're talking to your department chair, whether you're talking to your romantic partner. If you can just stop and go, okay, I'm getting a little amped up, let's take a step back, here's what I'm really trying to say, that can be really, really helpful. So we need to pay attention to meta communication. And it's interesting in the research to kind of bring some of this into play is, meta communication is something that gets used a lot. We tend to do it, but the ways in which we do it, where it's effective versus ineffective, are really interesting. So in John Gottman's research, he found that unhappy couples or romantic partners have really long chains of meta communication that just continue to escalate. But happy couples have short chains of meta communication followed by an agreement. So the difference in that is, it just, again, your tone and your body language. So you see couples that are fighting, if you and your spouse are having a discussion and fighting, and you say, well, you're getting angry. Well, you're getting angry. Well, I'm trying to get my point across. And it turns into like, we're communicating about communication, but it's not taking a step back and like trying to calm it down. It escalates. But for the happy couples, they're the ones that can kind of check themselves and go, hey, it's too angry. I'm, paying attention to my tone and my body language, and I'm coming at you aggressively. And I know that that's probably not being taken well. So it's about self-regulation in those moments. It's about being conscious of how you're feeling, which is actually going to come into my very last slide. So I'll continue with that in a second. But again, you're going to hear me say so often about checking yourself, right? Like, how are you feeling in this moment? What are you communicating in this moment? Because a lot of times we get caught up in things where we're not, like Josh's example was beautiful, where we're not actually communicating what we meant to. Once we really stop and go, okay, what's going on and what is this other person really seeing? That's where those assumptions come in, and it causes issues in your relationship. All right, so this is one of John Gottman's, claim to fame. So he, if you ever heard the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse, this is John Gottman. It's really interesting, throughout his research with people and their relationships, he really identified some of the major kind of dysfunctional types of communication that we utilize with each other that causes conflict and that can escalate conflict. And so it's things like criticism, right? So saying a statement that implies that something is globally wrong with you. It's a big part of startups a lot of times when you come in a room and you go, well, what are you doing? Why are you doing it that way? Or, you should have been doing this and you didn't, right? So implying that like something is wrong with what's happening in that situation. So we tend to use criticism a lot in startups, which isn't very helpful when we think about it because it starts the direction and the trajectory of that. Defensiveness is another one. We use this a lot. It's an attempt to defend myself. So whenever that meta communication maybe isn't going as well, or you're coming at somebody aggressively, this is the response that we typically get. And the problem with defensiveness is that it doesn't take the communication into a productive way. If anything, you are too worried about, fending off an attack than you are actually, number one, hearing what the other person is saying, and number two, understanding what you want to say in return. So defensiveness is all about like, I'm feeling attacked and I'm coming at you in any way I can to protect myself. So it really like muddies up the communication of what's actually trying to be discussed. I'm going to skip contempt because I'm going to get to that one. Stonewalling is one that we do a lot of times. John Gottman does a lot of research on like men versus women, some of which I agree with, some of which I think is overgeneralized. But typically this is one we see, I know, right, John? This is one we see in men, so Gottman says, and I think that's probably a little bit true, but I think anybody can utilize this. This is withdrawing from the interaction. So it's looking away, it's not making eye contact. If you're fighting with a partner or you're even in a faculty meeting and, you just start kind of like zoning back out and you're like, yeah, okay. you're not engaged in that conversation anymore. And that can cause the other person to feel, like you're not listening. It can cause them to come back at you with defensiveness. And it can just really, again, kind of steer the conversation in a negative way. Contempt is one I'm going to talk a little bit more about, but this is the one that
Carly, can I break in real quick?
Oh, please do.
About stonewalling, one of the things that I heard that was really useful is that stonewalling often happens when one member of the couple or whatever cares a lot. I'm sorry, my cat's playing in the litter box. That's great, y'all. I don't know if y'all can hear it. Sounds like a rainstorm. When one member of the couple actually really cares about resolving something and the other one doesn't. And so a lot of the gendered stuff that you hear about men stonewall is because the woman has some issue that she feels needs to be resolved, and the man is stonewalling. But they found that happens just as much in the other direction when the man has some issue that they want to. So it's not really gendered as much as Gottman presented it. And I heard that like who cares to resolve the issue is really what ends up setting up the interaction.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in those examples too, obviously that person is not doing a clear enough job at talking about how important something is to them, right? And having that conversation for that other person to really understand that this is really important to the relationship. Again, leaving gaps for assumption causes us all difficulty. With contempt, it's anything to show a way to devalue your partner or to hurt them. So this can be something as small as eye rolling, or it can be something as difficult as name calling and things like that. So this is the one that's really about I am showing you that I don't value you and that I want you to hurt. So I'm going to get back to that one. But the last one, and it says the 4 horsemen, and I realize there's 5 bullet points there, because later in Dr. Gottman's research, he really discovered that there is another one that's pretty bad, and it's what he calls no horsemen. So this is emotional disengagement. So this is not, this is the couple you'll see or the 2 people you'll see where there's no fighting, but there's also really not much interaction. So this is described a lot of times, in our clinic, we'll see the partners that are, like roommates, the roommate partners, right? That they're just not even willing to engage in a fight anymore because they're so kind of checked out of how difficult things are getting. So it's completely disengaging emotionally. And this is a really tough one to come back from. It's definitely possible. But by this point, this is a couple or a relationship where they've probably been through a lot of these horsemen over a long period of time. And they're at a place where they're just completely disengaged. So that's just an extra one. But if you go to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit more about contempt. Contempt is a really interesting one. What they've found over the years is that criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, they're very common. Even really satisfied and healthy couples and healthy relationships, we use these. They pop up, they happen. But the one that's kind of the outlier is contempt. That is the one that we don't typically see in couples that are healthy. They don't try and devalue each other. They may criticize, they may be defensive, they may even stonewall, but we don't see this level of devaluing or hurting the other person. So contempt is really seen as the toxic 4 horsemen, or one horseman of the 4. And it's one that, when we see it, when we work with couples, when we work with families, it's one that we typically point out very quickly, and we give that kind of education about it, because if we can control the contempt and stop that devaluing of each other, and at least recognizing that they're doing it, and where that's coming from, because usually it's coming from I hurt and I want you to hurt kind of a place, then we can really move forward. So if you're in a relationship or you have a difficult relationship of some kind, if you're using contempt, if your partner's using contempt, know that that's a really toxic one, and one of the first ones to try and get rid of in the way you're talking to each other. So this next concept that Josh gave us a good example of is my favorite, because it can be so helpful. And so it's repair attempts. So whenever you've been in an argument or a disagreement with anybody, and somebody that you like, whether it's a friend or somebody that you love that's a partner, when you think about it, when things start to go awry, when anger starts to creep up or frustration, we try a lot of times, at least one of the partners will try to de-escalate it. And that's really what these repair attempts are. It's an attempt in the midst of a heated conversation to support, to soothe, or express appreciation for that partner, or to de-escalate what's kind of happening and to reconnect. So when I teach about this to my students, I always use the example of my husband's favorite repair attempt is humor, which just ticks me off sometimes. But, you know, we'll be in a car and we'll be debating or we'll be arguing about something. And his famous repair attempt is he'll find some way to make me laugh. And then I roll my eyes and I'm like, you know, contempt, right? I roll my eyes, but I'm just like, oh, and he makes me laugh. But it de-escalates the situation. It will bring us to a place where we can be more conscious of, all right, how are we actually talking with each other? How are we actually feeling? And what's actually this conversation about? Because at this point, it's too frustration filled. What we find is the more distressed the marriage, the higher rate of repair attempts, but also the higher rate of them failing. So when you're in a really difficult situation and you're conflicting, it's not just about if you try and make a repair attempt, but it's, does the partner recognize that repair attempt and accept it, right? You know, conversations with my husband and I could go one of two ways. He could make a funny comment that tries to de-escalate and I laugh and then check myself, or it could tick me off more and I could just, you know, criticize him more for even attempting to repair the situation, right? And so we see this in distressed couples. Reasons for that, you know, number one, I think sometimes they don't realize that that is actually an attempt to repair. I think sometimes we think, you know, like my husband's being a smart aleck, or he's just trying to not listen to what I'm saying, instead of me really recognizing that it's him trying to calm us down, right? And so by even teaching people about this, I think it's really helpful, because then you can recognize it and you can, you know, catch it when it happens and realize that that's really something that the other partner is potentially trying to do, is to de-escalate, not to, you know, change the subject or not to just be a smart aleck, but to actually try and de-escalate the situation. And then what they found is even when the four horsemen are present, so we're, you know, criticizing, someone might be stonewalling or being defensive, they found that if a repair attempt is effective, like 83% of the couples were stable and happy later on in the repair attempt, right? So like, even if I'm criticizing my husband and he's being defensive, if one of us throws in a repair attempt that the other one accepts, there's a large possibility that we're going to be okay in that conversation. It's going to switch it. But again, I think the trouble with it is you have to recognize that it's happening. And so you can't just throw it out there and the other person might escalate, right? So again, I think it's important to teach about the idea of repair attempts so that we know that it is a way in our communication with people that we do try and de-escalate. And so to look out for those and respond to those in maybe a less critical or defensive manner. So I hate teaching about this. I don't want to say hate. I don't like to use the word hate. I don't love teaching about this conflict blueprint. It's great. It's this idea, and some of you may have heard of it before, right? You have the speaker role when we communicate and the listener role. And the reason I don't love it is because when you really break it down, it's not a way that we typically communicate. It doesn't come naturally. And so whenever I start to teach about the conflict blueprint, the reason I leave it in there is because I want y'all to know that although I'm going to lay out some like rules for being a listener and a speaker, you know, it's the way we take that information and make it fit in our own lives. You know, we're not going to constantly use an I statement, the idea of like, well, when you know, slammed the door, I felt dismissed and I need you to pay attention to my feelings so that we can be closer, right? Like we don't talk like that. Like that's very hard to do. And it's really funny because with I teach marriage and family therapy students. And so I teach them how to be therapists. And it's always hilarious in the beginning because, you teach them this idea of this conflict blueprint and they present it to couples and they try and get them to do it. And the couples are just like, oh yeah, okay, sure. I'm going to put this on my refrigerator and look at it and talk to you in the kitchen like this. It always fails. It doesn't happen. But if we can teach these skills and we can understand the role of the speaker and the listener, we can at least, again, be conscious of it when we're talking to somebody. Whether, again, it's a coworker or a department chair that you're trying to, talk to, be aware of what role you're playing and are you playing it successfully? Are you successful in being the speaker? Are you successful in being the listener at this point? So no one can engage in persuasion until both people can state each other's position and understand what each other are saying, right? I mean, this goes back to the idea of we can't leave room for assumption. So if I'm debating with my husband about something or we're trying to figure something out and we're getting a little frustrated, I need to fully understand his position before I can even go like, well, hey, I don't think that's going to work. And he needs to understand my position before we can move forward in our conversation. And so this is what this really does, right? So you really want to support your partner and trying to stay in the like, what is this mode instead of like, what the heck is this mode, right? So it's this idea of not leaving room for assumption, being clear and respecting that you and your partner may be having a disagreement, but we can understand where each other are coming from. That's huge. So that's really what this is about. It's not about using I statements and talking in ways that you wouldn't typically talk.
I'll just add to that, Carly, that I think that like one of the things that I've said that has worked is you don't walk the same way on the edge of a cliff as you do when you're not on the edge of a cliff. Right?
I love that. Yes.
Right. So when you're in the middle of like, and for me, like I often find myself like in the middle of an argument, not realizing it had started.
Right.
And so like, that's when I'm like, whoa, wait a minute, what's happening? And that's when this can be helpful. Like, okay, let me listen. Let me find out. I'm not going to like interact the same now as I would when everything's fine.
Exactly. I love that.
I've had that help me and some people.
I will more than likely steal that the next time.
Steal away.
Oh, I will. So really quickly, there are two roles. You're a speaker or you're a listener. The typical like best case scenario speaker role is that you're not blaming. You're talking more about yourself and what's going on for you than you are about the other person. That's an easy one to catch if you pay attention to how often you're saying the word you. I think sometimes it's unavoidable to point something out in somebody else, but if that's all you're saying and you're not talking about your position or your emotions or what your thoughts are, then it's going to become very critical. It's going to become very blaming, and we're going to just jump right into those four horsemen, right? Because they're going to feel attacked and defensive. And so the more you can approach a conversation with sharing kind of your side of things and the way you view things really helps us to recognize that we all have different perceptions. None of us are the same person. There's a lot of research out there that talks about how one of the biggest difficulties in relationships is when we try and make the person that we're talking to into ourselves. Like, I want you to think like me. I want you to react the way I'm reacting. I want you to feel the way I'm feeling. And that's just unrealistic because none of us are the same person, right? And so we have to share our perceptions and do it in a way where we're going to make we're going to make it very understandable and very well known that my position is going to be out the gate not the same as the person I'm talking to, because we're different people. And so if we can remember to recognize that, then we can go, okay, well, I need to share more about me and what I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, as opposed to criticizing the person in front of us. You want to talk about your feelings. This is such a therapy thing to say, right? Like, how do you feel? Let's talk about our feelings. And people tease me all the time because I always go down that rabbit hole of like, well, tell me about the feelings. Let's process. But I think there's something so true about that. I think if we, there's been all sorts of evidence-based theories and therapy out there, with all different combinations of people, mothers and children and fathers and partners, where if we can just get to a place that's below the surface. So it's not just what I'm complaining about. It's not just what you did. It's not just what I couldn't do, but it's what is it making me feel like? It does a softening process. It turns it from feeling criticized and like we have to defend into a process of, oh, okay, I can hear that. I can hear that. I can connect with that hurt. I can connect with that pain. It becomes much more of a connection point when we go to that. There's some great research in emotionally focused couples therapy by Susan Johnson, and she talks a lot about this idea of softening conversations. And that's what this is about. If you go to that deeper level, like if you're really ticked that your partner came home late and you needed them to do things and they didn't, stop and go, why does that make me so mad? Like, why does that really make me mad? Is it because I don't feel valued? Is it because I didn't feel heard? Is it because I'm feeling like they're not caring about me? And that's a very different thing to say to somebody, hey, I'm feeling really uncared for, as opposed to, well, why in the heck were you home late? Right? Like there is a very different vibe that comes off when you're saying what's going on feelings wise. Again, using I statements, I kind of talked about that. When somebody does something that you don't agree with, talk about how you are feeling, talk about you. And then this is the toughest one. This is the one I think that we don't always get to in our communication, but stating a positive need. So that idea of like, what is it that you need? What is it that you need to have been done differently? I still work with some clients, and I've had a lot of clients say things like, well, that conversation was terrible and my mom was so mean and things were awful and it just didn't work out. And so my question a lot of times is, well, how would you have wanted it to go? Like, what is it that you actually needed in that moment? Because a lot of times what we assume is that the other person knows the answer to that, right? Like the other person knows what they're supposed to be doing in that situation, and they don't. Like they just don't. We're not mind readers. We can't read each other's minds. And so if you can say, hey, I'm feeling like you weren't caring about me because you came home late, and what I really needed to happen is this, then it gives an opportunity for that person to correct whatever the situation is, right? But if I just say like, you didn't come home and I'm mad at you, well, okay, but there's no need there. There's no clear statement of what is it that you really wanted to happen. Again, it just takes out that assumption piece. You're so specific about this is what I'm feeling like, and here's what I would have liked to happen, or here's what my need is. There's no room for assumption in that. It's very clear and it's very overt. So that's kind of some tips about being a speaker in a relationship. And then the listener role. So as hard as that was, the listener role, I think a lot of times can be a little bit more difficult because we tend to be individualistic and we want to share our thoughts and we want to think about what we're going to say next. And we catch ourselves doing this all the time in conflicts and in debates. But really, the best way to be a listener is to stop focusing on what you want to say, postpone your own agenda, and hear and really truly understand what the other person is saying, which takes a slow down kind of mechanism, right? Slow yourself down and listen to what the other person is saying. I think the reason that's so hard, number one, it's hard for us to slow down and not think about what we want to say in that moment. But I think it's also hard because it takes a want to understand the other person. And it takes I really want to understand and learn from this other person's perspective. And so recognizing that that other person is not me, that other person has a different perspective, and I need to hear them out, and I need to hear what that perspective is really important. Hearing the speaker's feelings. So again, talking about feelings and emotions, validating the speaker by completing the sentence. Like, it makes sense to me that you would feel this way. and have these needs because, right? So one of the things, my husband and I are an outlier because he's also a marriage and family therapist. So we get teased a lot by that. People are always like, oh, you must have the best relationship ever. And I'm like, yeah, we just know when we're dysfunctional and then just continue, sometimes. But I think, my husband and I have worked on this because we've both learned this, but, where I can recognize that his view of this is very different. And I can say, I see how that makes sense in your perspective, but mine's different. And here's what I'm thinking instead, right? Like that is a great way to approach a situation where you may have very differing opinions. Tell that person, like, I can see where you're coming from. Like, I understand what you're saying. That doesn't mean I have to agree with it. But just by letting the other person know, like, hey, I get what you're saying, can be really validating to that person and keep that escalation from occurring. And then it's okay to ask questions. If you really don't understand that person's perspective, like if you are confused and don't get it, don't shut them down, but ask a question, right? Like, I'm confused about what you're saying, or I need more detail, or I'm still unclear about your perspective. So ask that. And then the last piece that applies to both the listener and the speaker is being flooded. And so flooded, right? I know I'm escalating, I'm getting angry, I'm getting too upset. I'm going to be talking 100% in my emotions and not actually thinking clearly. And so taking a break can be really helpful. And I love this right now when we're all kind of stuck at home with our families, right? And we're needing breaks sometimes. But here's my biggest issue with breaks, because I think a lot of us have probably heard that, right? Like, take a break and calm down, take a timeout time, right? That's important. But what's more important is what you're doing in that break. If you walk away from a conversation because you're recognizing that you're too upset, that's awesome. But that next most important step is, what are you doing in that break? Are you sitting there ticked off, like fuming and ruminating about what happened, coming up with more things to say? Or are you spending that time checking in with yourself and going, okay, why am I so upset right now? What is my need? What is my emotion that I'm feeling right now? Let me do some deep breathing to calm myself down. So those breaks really need to be productive, and they need to be about you checking in with those things we just talked about. Your emotions, what are your needs in this? What is your perspective in this? How is it different from the person you're talking to? And then it can be really helpful to come back after that productive break. But we just got to make sure it's productive and you're doing things that are helpful in the de-escalation of that.
And one of the things that I'll say about that is Gottman says that it can't be less than 15 minutes. That less than 15 minutes, like you didn't actually calm down. You just thought you calmed down, but you didn't actually. It has to be 15 minutes. And one of the cues that you can use is when you get away, if you're still finding yourself thinking of things you should have said or that you want to say, you haven't gotten to the self-soothing part yet. So it's 15 minutes after you quit doing that you're actually self-soothing.
Exactly. Because it's just going to not work out otherwise.
Right.
So this last slide is a concept actually that comes from Virginia Satir, who is in the marriage and family therapy world, one of our kind of OGs of the marriage and family therapy field. And it's this really simple equation that I think can be helpful for all relationships. But this is truly the equation for a healthy relationship. And it seems very simple. It's me plus me equals we. But what this states is that it takes two healthy individuals to create a healthy relationship. And so breaking that down, there's a lot in this, right? It's this idea that there are two separate people, and these two separate people are different individuals and have different perspectives and different needs, recognizing that. And then the healthier that each one of those individuals can be in things like practicing focusing on my emotions and regulating those and understanding what my needs are and what is it that I'm actually trying to say. If you can get two people to be in that realm, you're going to have a healthy relationship come out of it. And so I think there's a lot of recognition, again, that there are separate entities that come from different experiences that are bringing a whole lifetime of difference into that relationship, whatever relationship it is. And if they can work on things that they're struggling with, like I'm quick to anger, or I, don't trust people well, or recognize those individual things that you struggle with, if you can work on those, you're so much better or closer to having a healthy relationship. And so I think I always like to teach this kind of at the end, because it's a recognition of like, pay attention to what's going on for you. Pay attention to the things you're struggling with. We're all struggling with things. And if there's something you can do to help yourself through that, it's going to not only increase your mental health and your ability to be a healthy individual, but it's absolutely directly going to feed into your relationships as well. That's it.
All right.
That's all I got today.
Great job. Y'all, do you have any questions? Like, I see. It looks like somebody has a question.
Yes.
You mentioned your clinic. Can you tell me a little bit more about your clinic? How can UA employees access your clinic for marriage and family therapy?
Yes, that's great. I always love to give a little like shameless plug to our clinic. So we're located on campus. Currently, we are taking new clients, but we're working via Zoom at the moment. But all of our students have been trained in telehealth and are doing sessions via Zoom. So we're called the Capstone Family Therapy Clinic, and we are a training clinic that's a part of HDFS, and it's underneath the umbrella of our marriage and family therapy concentration. And so all of the therapists in our clinic, we have up to about 15 to 20 therapists working at one time. And we provide mental health services for individuals, for couples, and for families. So we kind of do the gamut. Our students are the therapists, so they're master's level. Their students get working on their masters in training, and they're all supervised by licensed and nationally approved supervisors. So I'm a supervisor, our program director is a supervisor. We have some supervisors from the community that are all approved supervisors through our national organization. And so they're never on their own, and they actually do incredible work. They're trained in things like evidence-based theories on trauma. We're trained in our marriage and family therapy specific theories. We're trained in specific evidence-based couples theories. And then we're trained in a lot of individual theories as well, like cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavioral therapy, like I said. So they really see everybody and anybody. We run on a sliding fee scale. So typically it's about your how many people live in your household and depend on your income, and then what your gross annual income is. Currently, and I hate to kind of put this out there, but I'm going to, currently, because we're working through telehealth and via Zoom, we're waiving fees at the moment. So it's a really extra super discounted rate right now. So the way you can get a hold of us is by calling our office number, which you will get just a voicemail because no one's actually in our office yet. But we check that regularly. So you can either email me directly, I'm totally fine with that, and I can set you up with somebody, or you can call our number at 348-8154. And that is our clinic, and we can get you going with a therapist. Thank you for asking.
I think I just sent that to everybody. I have one tip. There aren't any other questions right now. But I think that one of the things that I think is really important in relationships is to develop habits of getting out of conflict. And we have habits of getting into conflict that we don't realize, but we can also really powerfully develop habits to get out. And one that I've found is really useful in my relationships when I find that escalation happening and I become aware that it's happened is to say, this is not how I want to speak to you. You're too important to me for me to speak to you like this. So let's take a little bit more time for me to calm down so I can talk to you the way I want to talk to you.
Yeah.
I find that that's like just so powerful to just be this like, oh, wait, like we're going to stop now because this is not the people that we want to be with each other. And in particular in my romantic relationships, but like outside of that too, like that can be a really useful tip. What other things, Carly, do you have to finish us up? Because we're almost done.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think one of the things I've learned in my relationships is even when it goes awry. So I talk about, right, like the perfect way to communicate, and we're all going to make mistakes in that, and it's not going to go well. Like I said, my husband and I still fight, even though we both know like all these perfect ways to do things.
I clearly do too.
Right, I know, but we still, right, we do, but like it's hard to implement, and even people like us who have, you know, like spent our lives looking at these things and researching these things, you know, it's hard to implement when emotions, you know, rise, and we know this and we're aware of this. I think one of the biggest things that I've learned to kind of modify and implement is when it goes bad. You know, when I snap at, whether it's my kids or my husband, you know, the people I'm stuck with right now, not that I'm stuck with them, I love my family, but you know what I mean? So, you know, when I snap, when I go off, when I yell, the occasional curse word, right? Contempt, right? But the best thing to do in that is walk away, right? Like get out of that situation. And then there's nothing wrong with coming back and saying your perception. So like saying what's really going on for you. So my husband and I, the typical pattern of the way we fight is, you know, we'll have a conflict. Typically I'm the more aggressive one. I don't know how that happened, but I tend to be. And so I'll, you know, like say some things, whatever, he'll say some things. And then we like leave or we walk away from each other heated. But then within, you know, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, like I'll swallow my pride and so will he. And I'll come in and I'll sit down and I'll go, all right, look, like this is what I was really trying to say. Like just a second, this is what I need you to know. Here's what I was feeling. Here's why I was triggered in that way. And that kind of repair conversation isn't necessarily in the midst of the fight, but it's afterwards. And there's nothing wrong with that. You know, like it's not like it's all or nothing, right? Like I had this big blow up and now I can't go back. I think the difficult piece to that, like I said, is swallowing your pride and swallowing that embarrassment of like, God, I just, you know, lost it.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what? I can still come back and I can still make it better. I can still improve it. So all is not lost. And that's very true for parenting with children as well.
Yeah, I bet. All right. Thank you so much, Carly. Thank you, everyone who joined us today. This is going to be recorded if you want to refer back to it, and Carolyn will have some other resources for you that she'll post on the website. So y'all have fun, have a good time, enjoy your relationships, get out of escalating conflict. All of them. Like we're all so angry right now because we're all scared. So let's figure out how to de-escalate as much as possible. And we've got more stuff coming up. It's on the wellness website, and I'll see you all soon. Y'all have a great day.